The tempest that ravaged Blackstone Bay on that fateful night in October was unlike any storm the residents had witnessed in living memory. Gale-force winds howled through the narrow streets, tearing shutters from their hinges and sending debris careening through the air like deadly projectiles. The sea, once a provider of sustenance and livelihood, now rose up in fury, its waves crashing against the weathered cliffs with such force that the very foundations of the town seemed to tremble. Dr. Evelyn Hartley, a marine biologist of some renown, arrived in Blackstone Bay a week after the storm had passed. The air was thick with the pungent odor of rotting seaweed and the acrid tang of salt, carried inland by the still restless winds. As she stepped off the bus that had brought her from the city, Evelyn's gaze was immediately drawn to the jagged coastline, where the aftermath of nature's wrath was painfully evident. The purpose of her visit, as far as her superiors at the Oceanographic Institute were concerned, was purely scientific. She was to assess the ecological impact of the storm on the local marine life and document any significant changes to the shoreline. Yet, as Evelyn made her way through the town's deserted streets, dragging her wheeled suitcase behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this assignment, something unspoken and ominous. Blackstone Bay had always been an insular community, suspicious of outsiders and reluctant to embrace change. But the eerie silence that permeated the town now was different. It wasn't the quiet of a small, sleepy coastal village. It was the hushed, fearful silence of prey hiding from a predator. The Driftwood Inn, a ramshackle establishment that had seen better days, was to be Evelyn's home for the duration of her stay. As she approached the front desk, an elderly man with rheumy eyes and skin like weathered leather regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "You'll be the scientist then," he said, his voice gravelly and low. It wasn't a question. Evelyn nodded, forcing a smile. "Dr. Evelyn Hartley, I believe a room was reserved for me." The old man, Josiah, according to his name tag, nodded slowly. "Aye, we've got you set up in room 7, top of the stairs, end of the hall." He paused, his gaze drifting to the window, where the angry sea was visible in the distance. "You'd do well to mind the tides while you're here, Doctor." "The sea? She's been mighty restless since the storm." There was something in his tone, a warning perhaps, that sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. But she was a woman of science, not superstition, and she quickly dismissed the feeling. "I'll keep that in mind, thank you." As Evelyn settled into her room, unpacking her equipment and setting up her laptop, she couldn't help but be drawn to the window. The view it offered was both breathtaking and unsettling. The sea stretched out to the horizon, its surface choppy and dark, almost black in the fading light of day. And there, just visible in the distance, was something that made Evelyn's breath catch in her throat. Rising from the churning waters like the spine of some gargantuan sea beast was a series of dark, jagged shapes. It took her a moment to realize what she was seeing. The storm had shifted the seafloor, exposing a section of reef that had been submerged for who knew how long. But there was something about the formation that seemed unnatural, too regular, too deliberate to be the work of nature alone. Evelyn's scientific curiosity was piqued. This unexpected development could provide valuable data for her research. She made a mental note to investigate the exposed reef at the earliest opportunity. As night fell, Evelyn found herself unable to sleep. The wind had picked up again, whistling through the cracks in the old inn's walls and rattling the window panes. But it wasn't just the noise keeping her awake. There was something else. A sound so faint she wasn't sure if she was really hearing it or if it was just her imagination. It was a melody, haunting and melancholic, carried on the wind from somewhere out at sea. The tune was unlike anything Evelyn had ever heard before, ancient and sorrowful. It spoke of loss and betrayal, of slumber and awakening. Despite its otherworldly quality, there was something irresistibly compelling about it. Before she knew what she was doing, Evelyn found herself out of bed and standing at the window, straining to hear the ethereal music more clearly. As she gazed out at the moonlit sea, she could have sworn she saw movement in the water. Massive, shadowy forms shifting beneath the waves, accompanied by a phosphorescent glow that seemed to pulse in time with the melody. Evelyn shook her head, forcing herself to step away from the window. She was overtired, she told herself. The long journey and the stress of the new assignment were playing tricks on her mind. There was no music, no movement in the water, just the wind and the waves and her own overactive imagination. But as she lay back down, pulling the covers tight around her, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the darkness was awake and aware, and that it knew she was here. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the sun a pale disk barely visible through the thick cloud cover. Evelyn rose early, eager to begin her investigation of the coastline. As she made her way down to the inn's small dining room, she was struck once again by the oppressive silence that seemed to blanket the town. The few locals she encountered on her way to the beach regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Their eyes seemed to follow her every move, and she could hear them whispering among themselves as she passed. The words were too low to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear, tinged with a sort of grim resignation. The beach was a scene of utter devastation. Debris from the storm was strewn everywhere, splintered wood, tangles of seaweed, and here and there the bloated carcasses of fish and other marine life. The sand was littered with strange objects that Evelyn initially took to be driftwood, but, upon closer inspection, revealed themselves to be something far more disturbing. They were effigies, crude representations of humanoid figures with elongated limbs and bulbous heads. Some were fashioned from driftwood and seaweed. Others appeared to be carved from some kind of dark, porous stone. All of them faced the sea, their blank faces turned towards the distant reef that had captured Evelyn's attention the night before. As Evelyn knelt to examine one of the figures more closely, she became aware of a presence behind her. Turning, she found herself face to face with an old woman, her skin as wrinkled and weathered as the cliffs that loomed over the bay. The woman's eyes, however, were sharp and alert, fixed on Evelyn with an intensity that was almost physical. "You shouldn't be here," the old woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The sea is angry. It remembers what we forgot, and now it wants to remind us." Evelyn stood, brushing the sand from her knees. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. What do you mean?" The old woman's gaze drifted past Evelyn out to sea. "The drowned god," she murmured. "We made a pact long ago. Protection for sacrifice. But we grew complacent, forgot our duty. And now—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Now what?" Evelyn pressed, her scientific skepticism warring with a growing sense of unease. The old woman's eyes snapped back to Evelyn's face. "Now it wakes," she said simply, "and it hungers." Before Evelyn could respond, the old woman turned and shuffled away, leaving the marine biologist alone on the beach with her thoughts in the eerie effigies. Over the next few days, Evelyn threw herself into her work, determined to focus on the scientific aspects of her assignment and push the old woman's cryptic warnings out of her mind. She took samples of the water and sand, cataloged the various species of marine life that had been affected by the storm, and made detailed observations of the changes to the shoreline. But no matter how hard she tried to concentrate on her data, Evelyn found her attention continually drawn to the exposed reef in the distance. There was something about it that nagged at her, a sense of wrongness that she couldn't quite put her finger on. It wasn't until her fourth day in Blackstone Bay that Evelyn finally got the chance to examine the reef up close. The tides had been unusually high since her arrival, making it impossible to safely approach the structure. But on this day, the sea had retreated further than she had yet seen, revealing a stretch of sand that led almost all the way to the base of the reef. Evelyn set out early, her sample kit slung over her shoulder and her camera hanging around her neck. As she drew closer to the reef, her sense of unease grew. What had appeared from a distance to be a natural formation now revealed itself to be something far more extraordinary and far more unsettling. The reef was, in fact, the remains of some kind of structure. Massive stone blocks, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of tides, formed the base of what must once have been an imposing edifice. Here and there, Evelyn could make out the remnants of carvings, strange symbols and depictions of creatures that seemed to blend human and marine features in grotesque ways. But it was what lay at the center of the structure that truly took Evelyn's breath away. A massive stone slab, easily 20 feet across, lay tilted at an angle, partially buried in the sand. Its surface was covered in intricate carvings, more detailed and better preserved than those on the surrounding stones. The central image depicted a colossal figure rising from the waves. Its body was that of a man, but vastly elongated and distorted. Where its head should have been, there was instead a writhing mass of tentacles. In one hand, it held what appeared to be a staff or scepter. In the other, it grasped a human figure poised to be cast into the sea. Surrounding this central image were smaller scenes, each more disturbing than the last. Evelyn saw depictions of rituals involving human sacrifice, of strange creatures emerging from the depths to claim offerings, of entire cities being swallowed by monstrous tidal waves. As she stood there, transfixed by the horrific imagery, Evelyn became aware of a sound, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to emanate from the very stone beneath her feet. It grew in volume, becoming a deep, sonorous tone that she felt more than heard. And with it came the melody she had heard on her first night in Blackstone Bay, the mournful, haunting song that had drawn her to the window. The tide, which had been out when Evelyn arrived at the structure, was now rushing back in at an alarming rate. Water swirled around her ankles, then her knees, the current tugging at her with unnatural strength. Panic set in as Evelyn realized the danger she was in. She turned to flee, but found her path back to shore already cut off by the rapidly rising water. As the sea closed in around her, Evelyn could have sworn she saw movement in the depths. Vast shadowy forms shifting beneath the waves, accompanied by pinpricks of bioluminescence that pulsed in time with the alien melody that now filled the air. The last thing Evelyn saw before the water closed over her head was a massive tentacle, easily as thick as an old-growth tree trunk, rising from the sea. As consciousness slipped away, she heard a voice, ancient, powerful, and filled with an eternity of sorrow and rage. "You have awakened me," it said. "Now you shall know the price of forgotten oaths and broken promises." Darkness took her then, and Evelyn Hartley knew no more. When she awoke, Evelyn found herself lying on the beach, the taste of salt in her mouth and sand crusting her eyes. For a moment, she was certain that what she had experienced had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare brought on by stress and an overactive imagination. But as she sat up, coughing and sputtering, she saw that her clothes were soaked through with seawater. And there, clutched tightly in her hand, was a small object she had no memory of picking up, a piece of carved stone, smooth and dark, depicting a tentacled face that seemed to stare back at her with malevolent intensity. Evelyn struggled to her feet, her mind reeling. She knew she should report what had happened, contact her superiors at the institute, perhaps even alert the authorities. But something held her back, a combination of fear that she wouldn't be believed and a growing irrational certainty that to speak of what she had seen would be to invite disaster. As she made her way back to the Driftwood Inn on shaky legs, Evelyn was acutely aware of the eyes of the townspeople upon her. They watched her pass in silence, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. She had the unsettling feeling that they knew exactly what had happened to her, and that they had been expecting it. That night, as Evelyn lay sleepless in her bed, the haunting melody drifted in through her window once more. But now, having heard it in its full, terrible glory, she understood it for what it was. A lament, yes, but also a promise. A promise of vengeance long delayed, but never forgotten. The drowned god had awakened, and Blackstone Bay would never be the same again. The days that followed Evelyn's terrifying encounter at the submerged temple were a blur of feverish research and growing paranoia. She threw herself into her work with a manic intensity, poring over historical records and geological surveys, desperate to find some rational explanation for what she had experienced. But the more she learned about Blackstone Bay's history, the more unsettled she became. The town's archives, housed in a musty basement beneath the local library, yielded disturbing hints of a dark past. Evelyn discovered references to an ancient cult that had once flourished in the area, worshipping a being they called the One Who Dwells Beneath. The cult's practices were only alluded to in the vaguest terms, but the repeated mentions of blood offerings and songs of supplication painted a grim picture. Most intriguing and troubling was a recurring symbol that appeared throughout the oldest documents, a stylized representation of a tentacled face, identical to the one carved on the stone fragment Evelyn had found clutched in her hand after her near-drowning experience. The symbol was often accompanied by a phrase in a language Evelyn didn't recognize, but which sent chills down her spine every time she saw it. Funglui Maglwinaf Cthulhu Relier Ugahnagl Ftagen. As she delved deeper into her research, Evelyn became aware of subtle changes occurring in Blackstone Bay. The already reticent locals grew even more withdrawn, their eyes haunted and their voices hushed. Several fishing boats failed to return from their nightly expeditions, their crews simply vanishing without a trace. And always, there was the song, that haunting, otherworldly melody that seemed to emanate from the very air itself, growing stronger with each passing day. One morning, about a week after her encounter at the temple, Evelyn awoke to find Blackstone Bay transformed. A thick, unnatural fog had rolled in from the sea, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The fog seemed to muffle all sound, creating an eerie stillness broken only by the distant lapping of waves and the occasional, mournful cry of a seabird. As Evelyn made her way through the deserted streets, she became aware of movement in the fog, shadowy figures that flitted just at the edge of her vision, always disappearing when she turned to look directly at them. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay, and Evelyn found herself struggling to breathe, as if the very atmosphere was becoming hostile to human life. It was on this fog-shrouded morning that Evelyn met Jeremiah Blackwood, the last living descendant of Blackstone Bay's founding family. She found him standing at the end of the town's dilapidated pier, gazing out into the impenetrable mist with an expression of grim resignation. "You're the scientist," he said without turning, his voice low and gravelly. "The one who's been asking questions about the old ways." Evelyn approached cautiously, unnerved by the man's stillness and the way the fog seemed to swirl around him, as if alive and aware. "I'm Dr. Evelyn Hartley," she replied. "And yes, I've been researching the town's history. There's so much I don't understand." "There's much you weren't meant to understand," Jeremiah cut her off, finally turning to face her. His eyes were the pale gray of a winter sea, and they seemed to look through Evelyn rather than at her. "But I suppose it's too late for that now. He's awake, and he remembers the old bargain." A chill ran down Evelyn's spine. "The drowned god," she whispered. "It's real, isn't it? All of it. The cult, the sacrifices, the thing I saw in the water." Jeremiah nodded slowly. "As real as you or I, Doctor? More real, perhaps. He was here long before us, and he'll be here long after we're gone. We thought we could forget him, break our ancient oaths, and live our lives free from his influence. But the sea never forgets, and now the price must be paid, must be." As if in response to his words, a low, rumbling sound emerged from the fog-shrouded bay. It was like nothing Evelyn had ever heard before, a sound that was equal parts whale song, earthquake, and the creaking of some impossibly vast structure. The pier trembled beneath their feet, and ripples spread across the water's surface, originating from a point far out in the mist-covered sea. "What's happening?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. "What does it want?" Jeremiah's gaze returned to the fog-covered bay. "What it has always wanted: worship, sacrifice, the acknowledgement of its power over us. For centuries our ancestors appeased it with offerings: criminals, shipwreck survivors, the occasional virgin in times of great need. In return, it protected the town, guided our ships safely through treacherous waters, and filled our nets with fish." He paused, a look of shame crossing his weathered features. "But as the years passed and the old beliefs faded, we began to forget. The sacrifices became less frequent, then stopped altogether. We told ourselves that the drowned god was just a myth, a superstition from a less enlightened time, and for a while it seemed we were right, but now, another rumble shook the pier, louder this time. In the distance, Evelyn thought she could see something moving beneath the surface of the water, something vast and dark and utterly alien. "Now it wants what it's owed," Evelyn finished for him, a sick feeling growing in the pit of her stomach. "All those years of forgotten sacrifices." Jeremiah nodded grimly. "The debt must be paid one way or another. Either we resume the old ways or—" He didn't need to finish the thought. Evelyn could see it clearly in her mind's eye. The town of Blackstone Bay swallowed by the sea, its inhabitants dragged down into the depths, to appease the wrath of an ancient, vengeful god. As they stood there on the pier, the fog began to lift, revealing a sight that would haunt Evelyn for the rest of her days. The sea was alive with movement, the water roiling and churning as if some immense beast was stirring just beneath the surface, and there in the distance, rising from the waves like a mountain breaching the surface of the ocean, was a vast, dark shape. It was only visible for a moment before the fog closed in again, but that glimpse was enough to shatter Evelyn's understanding of reality. She had seen a massive, squid-like head, easily the size of a skyscraper, its surface a writhing mass of tentacles. And there, set within that alien visage, was an eye larger than a house, ancient and full of malevolent intelligence that seemed to fix directly on Evelyn with terrifying recognition. The song that had haunted Evelyn's dreams now filled the air, no longer distant and ethereal but immediate and overwhelming. It spoke of ages past and futures yet to come, of the insignificance of human life in the face of cosmic powers beyond comprehension. And underlying it all was a demand for acknowledgement, for worship, for sacrifice. Evelyn stumbled back, her mind reeling from what she had seen. "This can't be happening," she gasped. "It's impossible. There has to be some explanation." "The only explanation is the one you've already seen with your own eyes," Jeremiah said, his voice tinged with a mixture of fear and resigned acceptance. "The drowned god has awakened, and Blackstone Bay must answer for its neglect." As if to punctuate his words, a series of massive waves began to pummel the shore, each one larger than the last. The sound of splintering wood and shattering glass filled the air as buildings nearest to the waterfront began to crumble under the onslaught. "We have to evacuate the town," Evelyn said, her scientific skepticism finally giving way to the undeniable reality before her. "We need to get everyone to higher ground, call for help." But Jeremiah was already shaking his head. "It's too late for that, Doctor. The drowned god won't let us leave. This is our penance, our reckoning for forgetting the old ways. The only question now is whether we'll face our fate with dignity or be dragged screaming into the depths." As they watched, a group of townspeople began to gather on the beach. Led by the old woman Evelyn had encountered on her first day in Blackstone Bay, they formed a circle and began to chant, a guttural, rhythmic sound that seemed to harmonize with the drowned god's unearthly song. To Evelyn's horror, she saw that they were dragging someone towards the water's edge. It was a young man, barely more than a boy, his eyes wide with terror as he struggled against his captors. "No," Evelyn breathed, realizing what was about to happen. "We can't let them do this, it's murder." She made to run towards the group, to try to stop the grotesque ritual before it could be completed, but Jeremiah's hand on her arm held her back with surprising strength. "If we don't give it what it wants," he said, his voice low and intense, "it will take us all. One life to save many. It's the way it's always been." Evelyn wanted to argue, to rail against the insanity of it all, but the words died in her throat as she saw what was happening in the water. The waves had parted, revealing a whirlpool of impossible size, its center a pitch-black void that seemed to draw in all light. And there, rising from that abyssal darkness, were tentacles, dozens of them, each thicker than the sturdiest oak and covered in suckers the size of dinner plates. The chanting reached a fever pitch as the sacrificial victim was forced to his knees at the water's edge. The old woman raised a knife, its blade glinting in the weird, diffuse light that filtered through the fog. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, one of the massive tentacles shot out of the water, wrapping around the young man and dragging him into the whirlpool before anyone could react. His scream was cut short as he disappeared beneath the waves, leaving nothing behind but ripples on the water's surface and the echoes of his final cry. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The waves calmed, the whirlpool collapsed in on itself, and the vast shape that Evelyn had glimpsed beneath the water began to sink back into the depths. The drowned god's song changed, becoming almost satisfied. Evelyn fell to her knees, retching onto the weathered planks of the pier. Her mind struggled to process what she had just witnessed, to reconcile it with her understanding of the world. But there was no denying the evidence of her own eyes, no matter how much she might wish to. As the fog began to dissipate, revealing a town battered but still standing. Evelyn realized that her life would never be the same. She had glimpsed a truth too vast and terrible for human comprehension, had seen the face of a God that cared nothing for human morality or the sanctity of life. And worst of all, she knew that this was only the beginning. The drowned God had awakened, and its hunger would not be sated by a single sacrifice. Blackstone Bay had remembered its ancient pact, but at what cost? And how long before the god's influence spread beyond this small, isolated town to threaten the wider world? As these thoughts raced through her mind, Evelyn became aware of a change in her perception. The world around her seemed somehow less real, less solid than it had before. And there, at the edges of her vision, she caught glimpses of impossible geometries and vast alien landscapes that existed alongside the mundane reality of Blackstone Bay. She realized, with a mixture of terror and a strange fatalistic excitement, that she had been changed by her experiences. The veil between worlds had been lifted, if only slightly, and Evelyn now stood with one foot in the realm of human understanding and the other in a cosmos of eldritch horrors beyond imagining. As she rose to her feet, her legs shaky but her resolve hardening, Evelyn knew that she could never leave Blackstone Bay. Not now. Not when she alone might hold the key to understanding the drowned god, and perhaps, someday, finding a way to break its hold over the town without resorting to human sacrifice. But even as she made this decision, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a terrifying question. Was she staying to save Blackstone Bay? Or had she already fallen under the sway of the drowned god's hypnotic song? As if in answer, the melody rose once more on the salt-laden breeze, and Evelyn found herself humming along, the alien harmonies feeling more natural in her throat with each passing moment. The weeks that followed the sacrificial offering were marked by an uneasy calm in Blackstone Bay. The townsfolk went about their daily lives with a veneer of normalcy, but Evelyn could sense the undercurrent of fear and resignation that permeated every interaction. The drowned god's presence was a constant, oppressive weight, felt in every crash of the waves and every gust of salt-laden wind. Evelyn threw herself into her research with renewed vigor, driven by a desperate need to understand the cosmic forces at play and find a way to break the cycle of sacrifice without dooming the town. Her room at the Driftwood Inn became a chaotic nest of books, papers, and hastily scrawled notes. The walls were covered in charts tracking tidal patterns, lunar cycles, and the dates of previous sacrifices, all overlaid with esoteric symbols she had gleaned from the town's oldest records. But for every fragment of knowledge she uncovered, new questions arose. The more she learned about the drowned god and the eldritch realms from which it hailed, the more Evelyn realized how woefully inadequate human understanding was in the face of such cosmic horror. Her nights were plagued by vivid, terrifying dreams. She found herself swimming through vast alien seascapes, surrounded by creatures that defied description. In these dreams, the drowned god's song was ever present, and Evelyn often awoke to find herself humming the unearthly melody, the taste of salt water on her lips. As the next full moon approached, the time when the old records indicated the drowned god's influence was strongest, a palpable tension gripped Blackstone Bay. Evelyn noticed more and more of the townsfolk gathering on the beach at night, their chants rising to mingle with the eternal song of their aquatic deity. It was during one of these nocturnal gatherings that Evelyn made a breakthrough in her research. As she watched the cultists from the shadows, their voices rising in an eldritch harmony, she noticed patterns in their movements, intricate steps and gestures that seemed to correspond to the rhythms of the drowned god's song. With a jolt of realization, Evelyn understood that these weren't just ritualistic dances. They were a form of communication. The cultists were using their bodies to trace out complex mathematical equations and geometric forms, creating a language that bridged the gap between human comprehension and the alien thought processes of their god. Rushing back to her room, Evelyn began to translate the movements she had seen into mathematical formulae. As she worked through the night, fueled by a manic energy she didn't fully understand, the equations began to coalesce into something larger, a grand unified theory that encompassed not just the physical laws of our universe, but the warped physics of the realms beyond. As dawn broke, Evelyn sat back, her mind reeling from the implications of what she had discovered. She now possessed a theoretical framework that could explain the drowned god's powers, its ability to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, and even the mechanics of how it exerted its influence over Blackstone Bay. But with this knowledge came a terrible choice. Evelyn realized that she could use this information in one of two ways: to find a method of banishing the drowned god and freeing the town from its influence, or to enhance the entity's connection to our world, potentially granting it even greater power over reality itself. As she pondered this dilemma, a soft knock at her door startled Evelyn from her reverie. She opened it to find Jeremiah Blackwood standing there, his face grave. "It's time," he said simply. "The god demands another offering." Evelyn's heart sank. Despite her breakthrough, she hadn't been quick enough to prevent another sacrifice. "Who?" she asked, dreading the answer. Jeremiah's expression was a mixture of sorrow and grim determination. "Me," he replied. "I've volunteered. As the last of the Blackwood line, it's my duty to atone for my family's role in breaking the ancient pact." Evelyn wanted to argue, to tell him about her discoveries and the possibility of ending this cycle of horror. But as she looked into Jeremiah's eyes, she saw a resolve that brooked no argument. This was his choice, his attempt at redemption for generations of neglect. As they made their way to the beach where the rest of the town had already gathered, Evelyn's mind raced. She knew she had the knowledge now to potentially stop this, to save Jeremiah and break the drowned god's hold over Blackstone Bay. But she also knew that any attempt to do so without proper preparation could have catastrophic consequences, potentially unleashing the entity's full wrath upon the world. The scene on the beach was one of controlled chaos. The townsfolk had formed a large circle, their chanting rising and falling in time with the waves. At the center stood the old woman Evelyn had come to know as the high priestess of this dark cult, her withered hands raised to the roiling sky above. As Jeremiah stepped forward to take his place at the water's edge, a hush fell over the assembly. The only sound was the crash of waves and the ever-present song of the drowned god, now so loud it seemed to vibrate in Evelyn's very bones. Time seemed to slow as Jeremiah turned to face the sea. His eyes met Evelyn's for a brief moment, and in that look, she saw not fear, but a strange sort of peace. Then, without hesitation, he stepped into the surf. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The water around Jeremiah began to churn and boil, and a familiar darkness spread beneath the waves. Evelyn watched in horror as massive tentacles, glistening with an otherworldly iridescence, burst from the water and wrapped around Jeremiah's body. But something was different this time. As Jeremiah was lifted into the air, his body began to change. His skin took on a greenish hue, and gills appeared on his neck. His fingers elongated, becoming webbed, and his eyes grew large and bulbous. With a start, Evelyn realized what was happening. The drowned god wasn't simply consuming Jeremiah, it was transforming him, molding him into some hybrid form that could survive in its aquatic realm. As the transformed Jeremiah was lowered back into the water, his new eyes locked onto Evelyn. His mouth opened and a sound emerged that was part human speech, part Eldritch song. "The door is open, Dr. Hartley, he waits for you." With those final, chilling words, Jeremiah disappeared beneath the waves, leaving behind only ripples and the echoes of his transformed voice. The cultists' chant reached a fever pitch, and then abruptly silence fell. The drowned god song, too, faded to a distant whisper. It was over, for now. As the townsfolk began to disperse, casting fearful glances at the now calm sea, Evelyn stood rooted to the spot. Her mind was awhirl with what she had just witnessed and the implications of Jeremiah's final words. She knew now that she stood at a crossroads. With her newfound knowledge and the apparent invitation from the drowned god itself, Evelyn could potentially bridge the gap between human understanding and cosmic horror. She could delve deeper into the mysteries of the universe than any human had before, possibly finding a way to end the cycle of sacrifice and free Blackstone Bay from its aquatic overlord. But the risk was enormous. To do so would mean opening herself up to forces beyond human comprehension, potentially losing her own humanity in the process, just as Jeremiah had. As she stood there on the beach, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Evelyn made her decision. She would stay in Blackstone Bay, continuing her research and watching for signs of the drowned god's influence. She would prepare herself, mentally and physically, for the day when she would have to confront the cosmic horror that lurked beneath the waves. But as she turned to walk back to the town, Evelyn noticed something that made her blood run cold. Her footprints in the sand were changing, each step leaving behind not the impression of a human foot, but something webbed and inhuman. The transformation had already begun. In the months that followed, Blackstone Bay existed in a state of tenuous equilibrium. The sacrifices continued, but less frequently, as if the drowned god was savoring each offering, drawing out the town's anguish. Evelyn's research progressed at a feverish pace, her understanding of the Eldritch mathematics governing reality expanding daily, but with each new insight, each step closer to comprehending the true nature of the drowned god, Evelyn felt herself slipping further from her humanity. Her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, and she found herself able to hold her breath for impossibly long periods. The townsfolk regarded her with a mixture of fear and awe, whispering that she had become a bridge between worlds. As winter gave way to spring, Evelyn knew that the time had come for her final confrontation with the cosmic entity that had reshaped her existence. On a night when the moon hung full and bloated in the sky, she made her way to the beach alone. Standing at the water's edge, Evelyn began to chant, her voice carrying the complex harmonies of the drowned god's song. The equations and geometries she had deciphered flowed from her in a torrent of sound and movement, forming a bridge between realities. The sea began to churn, and the familiar darkness spread beneath the waves. But this time, Evelyn did not retreat. Instead, she waded into the frigid water, her transformed body barely registering the cold. As the massive tentacles rose from the depths, Evelyn felt no fear. She had come to understand that what humans perceived as a monstrous god was merely a fragment of a vast, cosmic intelligence, an entity so far beyond human comprehension that terror was an inadequate response. The tentacles wrapped around her, not to drag her down but to lift her up. As Evelyn was raised into the air, she saw the full majesty of the drowned god revealed. It was a sight that would have shattered a human mind, but Evelyn's transformed psyche could perceive the beautiful, terrible truth of its existence. In that moment of connection, Evelyn understood everything. The drowned god was not evil, not in any human sense. It was a force of nature, as integral to the functioning of the universe as gravity or time. The sacrifices, the terror it inspired, these were merely the side effects of its attempts to communicate with beings so far beneath its level of existence. With this realization came a choice. Evelyn could use her understanding to sever the drowned god's connection to Blackstone Bay, freeing the town from its influence. But doing so would destabilize the delicate balance of cosmic forces, potentially unleashing far greater horrors upon the world. Or she could embrace her role as intermediary, using her unique position to guide both humanity and the drowned god towards a new form of coexistence. It would mean the continuation of sacrifices, but with purpose and understanding, rather than blind terror. As the waters closed over her head and Evelyn felt herself being drawn down into the lightless depths, she made her choice. She would become the voice of the drowned god, the interpreter of its cosmic will. Through her, humanity would learn to navigate the treacherous waters between mundane reality and the vast, unknowable realms beyond. In years to come, Blackstone Bay would become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the true nature of reality. And on nights when the moon was full and the stars aligned just so, visitors would sometimes catch a glimpse of a figure standing in the surf. A woman with pale, translucent skin and eyes that reflected the vast depths of cosmic understanding. And always, always there was the song, the haunting melody that spoke of realities beyond human ken, of sacrifices made and prices paid, of the eternal dance between humanity and the unfathomable forces that shaped the universe. For in Blackstone Bay, the veil between worlds had been lifted, and the drowned god's lament had become a symphony of cosmic truth, with Evelyn Hartley as its eternal conductor.